Open your Bibles to John chapter 7, and welcome back as we continue through the book of John. And if you're watching this, I'm glad you are, because that means that you are taking time out of your day to feed yourself spiritually and to supplement your personal walk with the Lord. And so I want to encourage you, as I've switched over to a once a week video upload, just like with youth group, just like any sermon or Bible study that you take part in, what you put into this is what you'll get out of it. Okay? So I just want to encourage you, give you some helpful tips. If you're watching this, put it on a big screen, put it on your iPad or something if you can. Get in a quiet spot, all right? Remove distractions. I encourage you to pull out a real Bible that you can make notes in, you can write things down in if you do that. If you have a notebook where you normally take sermon notes, get that out. Just prepare yourself to study. I'm going to ask you, as I've been doing, to pause and write down questions and answers. Do that. Take the time to pause and to think on the scripture that we're about to look at. So, just like church, just like youth group, the purpose of these video uploads is for you to supplement your regular spiritual food, to bring more into your life and heart. All right. So with that being said, why don't you go ahead and pause the video if you haven't taken time to pray yet and talk to the Lord about what you're about to look at and read. Do that. So pause, pray if you haven't done so, and then read chapter 7 and start in verse 1 and go all the way down through verse 13. All right? So go ahead and do that. As we begin into chapter 7, there's something that I want us to think about here from chapter 6 going into chapter 7. All right? The first thing that we want to notice is we want to notice the time frame. Okay? The time frame that we're looking at here, if you're wondering, how long has it been from the end of chapter 6 until chapter 7? The answer to that is actually, if you look at verse 2 of chapter 7, it says, "Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand." If you recall back to the beginning of chapter 6, it mentions the Passover. Okay, so we can discern from the Jewish calendar, from the Feast of Passover all the way to the Feast of Tabernacles would be about a 6-month time frame. So from the end of chapter 6 going into chapter 7, there's been about a 6-month break that the disciple John is not covering. Now, portions of that we can discern from the other Gospels, what's been happening there. Now, as you've read through this, there's really kind of a couple different sections going down through verse 13, and like normal, we're just going to take them bit by bit. But really, this first section that I want us to be thinking about is Jesus' growing notoriety. Okay? The miracles that Jesus has done so far, the teaching that he has been giving has made his fame grow. And people are reacting to that in all different ways, as we've been seeing. And so in verse 1, you notice it says that Jesus walked in Galilee, so that gives us a location. Why is he doing that? It means that he's been spending time in Galilee. And it says, why is he doing that? Rest of verse 1, "For he would not walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him." So there's actually people who are out to kill Jesus because of what he's been teaching. So think about that. For about 6 months here, Jesus has been avoiding Judea, and he's been staying local and near his hometown in Galilee. And from the other Gospels, we can discern, what has Jesus been doing in that 6-month time frame? He's been doing some public ministry in Galilee. He's still doing some miracles. The other Gospels also indicate to us that he's been spending time with his disciples. He's been mentoring. He's been teaching them. He's been investing in them. And what's Jesus doing with that time? He is preparing the disciples for when he will no longer be on earth. He's preparing the disciples to lead the church. All right. So and now it tells us, again, the time frame here. So it gives us the location. He's been in Galilee. The time frame, verse 2, now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. Let me just explain that to you a little bit if you are not familiar with the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. All right. Now, there's a couple Jewish feasts that would be pilgrimages to Jerusalem. So this is a pilgrimage festival in which everyone is going to go to Jerusalem, and the purpose for the Feast of Tabernacles was to commemorate and to celebrate God's provision for Israel in the wilderness when he led them out of Egypt. Okay, so the Jews would all come to Jerusalem. They would have these feasts. There'd be lots of ceremonial things that they would be doing, but it's called the Feast of Booths or tents or tabernacles because much like Israel had no permanent home during their time of wandering in the wilderness, they lived in tents. And so the Jews would actually, for this week period, they would essentially camp out. They would live in tents. They would bring their tents. They would set up tents on their rooftops if they lived in Jerusalem. And that's how they would spend the feast. So it's this time frame of focusing on God's provision for Israel. So it is about a week-long, or technically an 8-day festival. So that'll come up again later as we move through chapter 7. So chapter 7 is all centered around this Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the bulk of these next several verses, verses 3 through 5, it goes into Jesus' family here. And I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about the disbelief of Jesus' brothers. The disbelief of Jesus' brothers. You say, that sounds interesting. And hopefully, as you've already read through the passage, you're picking up what is going on here. I want you to cross-reference here, pause the video and cross-reference to a couple different spots in the other Gospels. I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 13 and read verses 53 through 58. So Matthew 13, verse 53 through 58. Okay, now that you've read that portion, I also want you to turn over to Mark chapter 6, which is a parallel passage or similar passage. So Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, and read those couple of verses. Now, as you've read through those, hopefully, why am I having you read those verses? Remember, I say that Jesus has been spending this time, the 6-month period, in Galilee, okay, in his hometown. And previously, when he had spent time in his hometown, what I'm wanting us to realize is that Jesus was not accepted in his hometown. Okay, he was not accepted by the people who had seen him grow up or who knew his family. All right, so I have a question for you, and again, I'm going to ask you to pause. I know I'm asking you to pause and play, but now I have a question I want you to think about. After reading those passages, pause the video and answer the question, how do you think Jesus' family was affected by local resistance to Jesus? How do you think Jesus' family was affected by local resistance to Jesus? Pause and answer that question. I'm not sure what answer you came up with. Obviously, I won't know. Maybe you could put that in the comments. That could help for some discussion there. Honestly, the way I answered it is that Jesus' family is not sure what to think of Jesus. Okay? Here they have seen Jesus do miracles. They are hearing his claims that he's the Messiah. But at the same time, Jesus, and I should clarify and say these are his half-brothers, okay? Because Joseph was not Jesus' earthly father. So these are his half-brothers. So you have to think about from their shoes. They're hearing all this, all the claims that Jesus is making, but then their friends, the people that they know in the city of Nazareth, who also know Jesus and who don't believe in him, Jesus' family is in this middle ground, trying to decide if they believe Jesus' claims or do they think he's crazy, like the other townspeople think. And that's where Jesus brothers are. So we can't say definitively for where they're at, but we can say that they're in a state of disbelief of Jesus in some regard, okay? And John tells us that. So what do they say to him? As this Feast of Tabernacles is coming around, they tell him to go to the feast. Verse 3, depart hence and go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou doest. So their call and their claim is for Jesus to show himself publicly, show himself to the world. Verse 4, for there is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou do these things, show thyself to the world. So they're seeing him do miracles in Galilee. They're hearing him teach in Galilee. And they're saying, okay, you've lost a whole bunch of followers. We know that from the end of chapter 6. So Jesus needs to establish, if he is the Messiah, then he needs to establish that. Now, their reasoning that they say is Jesus needs to prove that he's the Messiah. There's no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeks to be known openly. His brothers are essentially saying to him, okay, if you're calling yourself the Messiah, Jesus, then you need to prove it. You need to show yourself publicly, not just in our local area. You need to show yourself at this big feast. And so that your disciples, and meaning general followers, not just the 12 disciples, so that people who are trying to decide what to believe about you, they can decide. If you're the Messiah, show yourself. And so the reasoning is that Jesus needs to prove that he's the Messiah. Now, what they say and what they mean are two different things, because what they say in verse 3 is so that thy disciples may see the works that thou doest. Okay, they say it's for the disciples, but what do they really mean? Is they mean it for themselves. Because look at verse 5. It says, for neither did his brethren believe in him. Wherever Jesus' brothers were at, his half-brothers, wherever they're at in their belief, they don't believe that he's fully the Messiah. Or maybe they believe that he could be the Messiah, but he's not the Messiah that they've been thinking would come. He's not being the political leader that they are thinking the Messiah is going to be. So their belief, we could probably say, is shaky at best. Okay? Now here's a wonderful little rabbit trail. Several of Jesus' brothers come to believe in him. And a couple of them actually end up writing books of the New Testament. If you don't know what those are, it's the book of Jude and the book of James, written by Jesus' brothers. So that shows us that they come to believe in him. But at this point, generally speaking, his brothers do not believe in him. Now, Jesus' notoriety has grown, and his brothers are pushing Jesus to show himself so that they can make a decision about what they believe about him. Jesus knows that. He knows where his brothers' hearts are at, and he knows what is going on in the rest of Judea and how people feel about him. So this leads us to the next several verses is Jesus, I want to put it like this, Jesus' timetable and Jesus' understanding. Now, I have a question I want you to ask yourself here. I want you to read verse 6, or pause the video, read verse 6, and ask this question. What does Jesus mean by your time is always ready in verse 6? So pause the video and ask yourself that question. The answer, I believe, what Jesus means in verse 6 is this. As he responds to his brothers, Jesus means that his timetable or God's timetable is not man's timetable. He says, my time is not yet come, but your time is always ready. Okay? God's timetable is not our timetable. Jesus means, that last phrase, the end of verse 6, is essentially, man always wants things his way. Jesus is saying, your time is always ready. You want to know right now. You want your answers right now. So his brothers want him to establish whether he's the Messiah or not, as they think of the Messiah, which is likely that political savior, that political leader. That's what they're thinking of Messiah. So they want him to establish that, and they want to know now. They want an answer in their paradigm now. I think it's a great parallel for us. Is that we want answers, and often we want them right now. And we want God's timetable to be our timetable. We want God to operate on our terms. The thing is that what they're asking about his identity is right in front of them. Sometimes the answer is right there, right in front of us. And maybe like Jesus' brothers, sometimes our faith needs to grow before we can see the answer. Maybe our timetable is not exactly like God's timetable. I think that's where Jesus' brothers are at. Now, let's move on here, and let's reiterate that Jesus' brothers do not understand who he is. And that's why Jesus says in verse 7, the world cannot hate you, but me it hateth. They can't understand the hate that is starting to grow for Jesus because they don't understand who he is. So they don't understand him. They can't understand the hate for him. Now again, reading verse 7, I want you to read verse 7, and I want you to pause, and I want you to answer two questions here. Pause, and you can write these questions down and then answer them. Based on verse 7, why does the world hate Jesus? And then also in verse 7, what does that word testify mean? So pause and answer those two questions. Hopefully you came up with this answer. I think this is the answer for us, and this is the answer Jesus gives. The world cannot hate you, but me it hates, because I testify of it, that the works thereof are evil. So let's put it like this. The world hates Jesus because he shows the sinfulness of man. The world hates Jesus because he shows the sinfulness of man. Now, Paul tells us, if you go to Romans chapter 3, verse 20, Romans chapter 7, verses 7, 8, and 9, if you want to pause and look at those verses, that would be a good thing to do. But Romans 3:20 and Romans 7, verses 7, 8, and 9, Paul's point in those two passages, and really in the book of Romans, is that the God's law, we could even think about the Ten Commandments, the law shows how sinful we are. Okay? We wouldn't know that stealing is wrong, except that God says, don't steal. Don't take things that don't belong to you. So that's how we know stealing is wrong. God sets morality for us. So the law shows man's sinfulness. How much more does the originator of the law, the creator of the law, show and magnify man's sinfulness? Think about this. Go back to John chapter 3. Okay? Turn with me to John chapter 3. And I'll turn there, and we'll read these verses together. We look at John chapter 3, and look at we'll read verse 18 down through 20, and I'll read those. You read along with me, okay? It says, he that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, this is the judgment, that light is come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. And everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither comes to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. So, in that passage in John chapter 3, what does Jesus do? Jesus is the light. He shines the light of his holiness on the dark deeds of mankind, the rebellion of mankind, the sin of mankind. And so here in chapter 7, Jesus says, the world can't hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it, that the works thereof are evil. Okay, so Jesus' brothers since they don't understand who he is, then they can't understand the hate that is growing towards him. And they can't understand his timetable. So he says, verse 8, go ye up unto this feast. I go not up yet. Yet is a key word. I go not up yet unto this feast, for my time is not yet full come. Okay, so Jesus is saying he's going to operate on God's timetable. Not on their timetable, on God's timetable. Now, the last couple of verses that we'll look at here, verses 10 through 13, I want you to notice the polarization of Jesus. Okay? So, if you notice out of verse 10, Jesus' brothers do go to the feast, and he waits till they've gone, and then he goes up to the feast, and he slips in secretly. So he proves his wise decision, because in verse 11 it says, then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, where is he? So think about this again. It's been 6 months since the feeding of the 5,000 roughly, and it's been even longer since Jesus did that controversial miracle in Jerusalem where he healed a man on the Sabbath day. So it's been an even longer time frame. So since that time, the religious leaders who want to kill Jesus, people who are wondering who Jesus is, people who are wanting to see miracles, all these different types of people know that with the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus should be there. So most everyone is looking for Jesus. And this is a pilgrimage feast. They know he's coming. And so they've been waiting for him. And it says the Jews sought him at the feast and said, where is he? And Jesus is he's kind of the talk of the town. Okay? Because as people are looking for him, there's actually these lots of divisive discussions going on about Jesus. That's what the word murmuring means in verse 12. It says, and there was much murmuring among the people concerning him. For some said, he's a good man. Others said, nay, he deceives the people. So there's these divisive, secret debates going on about Jesus. We'll talk about that more in a second here. Some people believe he's good. Some people believe that he is causing trouble. He's deceiving the people spiritually, which in the religious culture of Israel, that's a big deal. Okay, so he's a very polarizing figure. That's the thing about Jesus, is he's becoming more and more polarizing. People are divided on what they believe about him. And that's why that word murmuring is key, because that means secret debate. Okay? And here's the thing. Verse 13, howbeit no man spake openly of him for fear of the Jews. And we would take that as fear of the Jewish leadership. Everyone is afraid to voice their opinion. That's why they're talking about it secretly, because no one is sure where the Jewish leadership stands. And when we move probably in the next video segment in verses 25 through 27, this is going to come up again, that people are not sure what to think about Jesus because they're not sure where the Jewish leadership, where the scribes and Pharisees stand on Jesus. So nobody wants to talk about him publicly because they're not sure what the religious leaders think about Jesus. This is where we're going to end today's segment. So again, I'd ask you, what application can you take from this passage and put into your life today? What does this mean for you today? As you think about that, I'd encourage you to put something in the comments in this video, and maybe we can get some discussion going there about what does this passage mean to you? How does this fit into your life today? What does this mean to us? I would again bring us back to that point about Jesus' timetable, about God's timetable, and that God's timetable is not ours. It is not always what we want, in that God operates in ways that we don't always understand. But I'd ask you to think on this. As Jesus knows what's perfectly best here, as he always does, can't we rest in his timing? And that he always knows the big picture. He always knows our situation. He always knows what's in our hearts. And we can rest in his timing, even if it's not our timing. especially if it's not. We can rest in His omniscience. We can rest in His wisdom. His timing, God's timing, is always better than ours. And we can rest and trust in that. So if there's other application that you'd like to make, other points that you'd like to make, I'd encourage you to put it in the comments. If you do that, we'll try and I'll reply to those and we'll go from there. But think on these things. I hope it's been a challenge to you to think on some of this and an encouragement as well. So thanks for watching. Spend some time in prayer on this, and we'll look forward to when we can all meet together again, and as we converse with you in different ways. All right. Thanks for your time.